Surprised by Joy tells the move that Lewis makes from atheism to Christianity, except he's not going to go about it the traditional way, or maybe not the traditional, the progressive way, of arguing through the different propositions and telling why each one may be true or false for whether or not there's a God and whether or not it's the Christian God, etc. Instead, what he actually does is he walks through his imagination and his conversion from his imagination to be baptized first by George MacDonald, then the conversion of his intellect by G.K. Chesterton, and finally that last move in the conversion of his will. So let's look at all three of those pieces, the different circles that Lewis goes through. The first one is the imagination. Lewis reads a book, Phantastes, by George MacDonald, which everyone in an Inklings course should read. Rereading George MacDonald's book caused Lewis to have a conversion of his imagination. Now, he does not say that he converted to Christianity. What happens is this former attraction to fantasy, because it allowed him an escape from the world in which he lived. As he mentioned elsewhere, there was the world of literature and poetry versus science and fact. There was the world on one side of fantasy and on the other of atoms and evolution. What happens here is that his imagination gets converted to seeing the world we live in as the fantastical world. It is the enchanted world. As he's sitting on this train and he describes the scene very sensually, understanding the smell of nuts at a train station, and he hears the call of the porter's voice, I saw the bright shadow coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all common things and yet itself unchanged. It's a beautiful picture that explains the kind of wonder and welcome that we saw in Chesterton in Orthodoxy, that this world is the world that is beautiful and magical and is a reflection of things that are higher and that are supernatural and surreal. He says in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader something similar. He takes this idea and tries to do it when he creates his own fiction. Aslan explains that he brings the children to Narnia so that by knowing him there, they'll know him better in their world. It's a way of understanding that the world of the imagination helps people know things they can't know just in their own life experience. What he learns in Phantastes he calls holiness. It's the sound of the sirens, but they sound like the voice of my mother or my nurse. Now, when he has this conversion with Phantastes and he realizes that this other world, this world of holiness and beauty, is actually reflecting the world that he's living in, he enjoys this experience, but he still doesn't become Christian. He actually thinks, well, it's too bad that George MacDonald has that hang-up about Christianity, right? He says a bee in his bonnet about Christianity. So he gets converted imaginatively, but doesn't actually make any moves towards any kind of faith at this point. The next step in his conversion is a move into the intellect. And here's this cartoon with Chesterton and Lewis. He loves Chesterton, though he hates or dislikes the fact that he's a Christian. When he writes of Chesterton in Surprised by Joy, he says that his humor was so funny because it was inseparable from the argument. So this is the humor we saw in Orthodoxy in The Man Who Was Thursday, that the wit is actually funny if you know the truth about reality. It's not something that is marginal or the joke can be cut away and the argument remains the same. He's actually indicting something through his humor, through seeing things or talking about things in a way that we don't normally look at them. And Lewis loved this way of changing perspective. He also said, I liked him for his goodness. Remember, during this time in the early 1900s, people are writing dark, depressing things. This is Eliot's wasteland is kind of the major trope of the modernist literature. People are upset about the war. They don't know what it's all for. There's a lot of suffering and a lot of darkness. And instead, Chesterton is light and joy-filled, and Lewis is responding to that. He thought that the answer to the world was to be in despair, and yet he's finding something different in Chesterton. Now, looking back on this, of course, he makes a facetious statement, in reading Chesterton as in reading MacDonald, so these become his two models for conversion that we get to read. I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. Bibles laid open, millions of surprises, fine nets and stratagems. God, if I may say so, is very unscrupulous. So this whole book, which is a journey about reading through these different stories that Lewis read that were drawing him, were changing his imagination, and now we have the move that takes place with MacDonald and then the move that takes place with Chesterton. So he's reading all these things and really getting converted by his reading, and then of course, lastly of all, he will get converted by his friendships with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. I want to look at the title one more time. What Lewis understands at first, the surprise by joy, is that joy, as we saw in that image of the early cover, that light breaks into the darkness. And so he begins to seek that light. What he discovers is that by trying to seek the things that bring him joy, he had lost the sense of what the object of joy actually was. So for example, in Squirrel Nutkin, if he had just dedicated himself, which wouldn't be a very adult thing to do, to studying Beatrix Potter in order to find joy, he would lose the joy. And that is what happens when he studies northernness. Balder is dead, and then he begins to study Siegfried and the gods, and he begins to study Norse mythology, and he turns it into something as a way of trying to control that sense of joy, that if he studies these things enough, maybe they'll continue that experience of joy and he can control it. But what he discovered is they were a reflection for the object of joy, which was outside of them. The northernness, the Norse myths, reflected the object that was actually giving Lewis the joy. They themselves were not the object. And by misplacing or misdirecting that energy, he was not experiencing the same joy he had as a kid. Joy, he realized, was a desire. But it could not be turned in and on itself. If you actually sought the joy for the joy, you turned it into pleasure. The value was in desiring beyond. And that object was not in his own mind or in his own body. In other words, what is giving the joy is from beyond the human person. If you chase the joy for itself, you turn it into just pleasure seeking. If you chase only the object for itself and you just study the object, then you're misdirected and you will still miss the joy. Later, Lewis will write of this and say, first things first, second things second. In other words, we first love these things, and then we can also have the second things. But if we put the second things before the first things, we lose both of them, right? So and this will be in Charles Williams' idea too, if you love the woman first when she is really supposed to be a pointer towards God for you, you've not only lost the love of the woman who you've turned into an idol, you've also lost the love of God. If you love God first, and that gift that he gives you for love helps you love the second thing, which is the woman, who may have been into your introduction but should have never been placed first. You get both the love of God and the love of the woman, right? So it's the first things first. And this is what he learns about the mysterious nature of joy, is that he cannot control it and he cannot decide how to direct it, that it is in fact a gift. The last move he talks about intellectually, he does not talk about imaginatively, though he does give an image of playing chess, but it is the chess player game, right? It's the logic game that Chesterton talked about in Orthodoxy. Poets do not go mad, chess players do. This is the last move that has been set forward by the imagination. It's been cleared the way by MacDonald and Chesterton, and this is the move of his will finally. He said, I examined myself and found a zoo of lusts. So he's able to truly see himself for what he is. He's not going to be one of Chesterton's madmen believing in himself. And he gives in. And he becomes first just a theist, believing just in a God. And he says these paradoxical things that really show Chesterton's influence over his mind. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. It's a very Chestertonian sentence. You can almost imagine that he was imbibing Chesterton's sentences as he tries to write sentences like this paradoxical coming to faith. The friendship between Tolkien and Hugo Dyson is what helped Lewis move from this idea of the things he had studied, right, the death of God myths, into understanding that they were part of this real world. In a similar fashion to how Phantastes moved him from seeing the fantasies as separate from the reality, he was able to then also move from the myths being separated from the history. He understood then the Gospels were not mere myth, but had in fact become fact. They were explaining facts. They had never been mere historical accounts, because of course they have mythical nature to them, but they'd also never been mere myths removed from history. They were particularized in which a person who was God incarnate came down and lived out the death of God myth. Then it's a very anticlimactic ending when his will converts. He says, when he and his brother Warnie set out, he did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, but when they reached the zoo, he did. So there is no dramatic sense of conversion for Lewis. Instead, we watch the gradual conversion of his imagination. You watch the intellectual conversion to theism that happens through the Viceroy of Chesterton. And then you get to see this last anticlimactic moment where he just switches the will and moves from, I didn't believe in Jesus Christ, and now I do. And it's that last move, myth became fact intellectually, and thus my will accedes to that. And Lewis's book then probably disappointed many reviewers who expected kind of the mere Christianity or the abolition of man, these logical arguments. And instead what he gives them is probably the first 2/3, almost looks like a Narnia story. It's the story of how his childhood relationship to literature actually moved him towards knowing who God was. These glimmers and these hints of joy throughout his life moved him to knowing the true object and true giver of joy.